Okay, well, it's really a sincere and true pleasure to have opportunity to introduce to you Dr. Brittany Patterson. She is really an expert school mental health practitioner and scholar from University of Maryland School of Medicine and the Department of Psychiatry. She actually has a wealth of experiences cutting across lots of different lenses through which we might think about school mental health intervention and support and training. And I know she has a really interesting talk for today that is going to be focused on mental health literacy. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to one of the top people I know in the whole field in this area, and I know this will be an interesting talk.
All right. Thank you all for bearing with me for that moment while I was getting myself situated. Dr. Fabiano, can you just confirm for me that you can see my slides and hear me? And I can't see
Yes,
any.
yes, good.
Thank you. Perfect. Well, it is my great privilege to be here with you all today. Dr. Fabiano did not share, but he is my former academic advisor and dissertation chair. And to him, I owe a debt of gratitude for lots of my training experiences that have supported my pursuit of the position that I'm in now. And so thank you, Dr. Fabiano, for all you've done for me in the past and for inviting me to this space. I'm Britt Patterson, and it is my pleasure to talk today about prioritizing mental health literacy and some of the work that we are doing to support schools and school mental health. I'm going to take just a brief moment, if my slides will cooperate, to introduce myself. I don't want to spend too much time here, but I am a psychologist by training. I graduated from a combined school and counseling psychology program, back in 2015, so many years ago. My expertise or interests really revolve around school mental health research, training, and practice, promoting the well-being of young people, their mental health and well-being in schools specifically. And my unique interests are in historically marginalized and minoritized populations. And so that's kind of the lens that I'm coming with today as I talk about how we can use mental health literacy to support our youth and some of their growing concerns around mental health. So just quickly, as you may know from the description, here's what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to briefly describe some key terms. I'll talk a little bit about strategies for integrating mental health literacy into what we refer to as multi-tiered systems of support. And then, of course, at the end, I want to leave you all with some resources that you can peruse at your leisure after today. But Dr. Fabiano may not have told you this, but I like to talk with people and engage with audiences. And so I am going to throw out a couple of questions here and there because I want to learn from your expertise and interest too. So before I get too far into my spiel, I would love to hear from you all. What are you hoping to take away from this talk? I understand that you all are in a PhD program for clinical science, and I want to ensure, if possible, that I speak to some of the interests you have. So I'm going to give you about 30, 40 seconds to type into the chat box. What is kind of a key takeaway you're hoping this talk can speak to? And folks are welcome to come off mute as well if you prefer, but you can use the chat box if you'd like. Oh, the all-star participant, Dr. Fabiano, what are some ways to check for connection, understanding when working with people in schools? Also, most appropriate ways to follow up to maintain relationships and interventions. I love that. that's certainly something that'll, I think, will be interwoven into some of the recommendations throughout. But thank you for that idea. I also invite others to share their thoughts or just random questions that you may have. I also want to acknowledge that maybe this just isn't a topic folks have heard a lot about, so it's hard to even ask a question. So what I'll do is invite folks along the way. Feel free to type in questions that come up. I cannot guarantee that I'll see the chat box, but by the end, if there are some questions that have not been addressed that pop up, we will leave some time at the end to talk about them. All right, so, and I apologize, I want to make weird noises here and there. I am under the weather, but doing my best to persist. So I'm going to start with what school mental health is not. So school mental health is not what we see here. It is not an outpatient clinic based outside of a school building or merely situated, nor is it an outpatient provider based in the school, but only providing tier 3, or what we refer to as tier 3 services. So that would be individual and family services for youth with identified mental health challenges needing intensive supports. School mental health is not that. School mental health actually is much more immersive. And we like to use the language comprehensive school mental health systems with some of the following descriptions so that we're all on the same page about what our supports and services should look like. And so when we're talking about comprehensive school mental health services, that's providing not just tier 3 and tier 2 services. It's a full array of supports and services that broadly promote positive school climate, SEL, well-being, while reducing prevalence and severity of mental illness in our school settings. Importantly, the work we do is not intended to be done in silo. It's intended to build upon a strong foundation of professionals with specialized expertise and working with them in strategic partnership to provide resources that are helpful for the community. That includes partnering with students, hearing their voices and elevating that in services we provide, but also partnering with families and other community health and mental health partners in the community. Crucial for providing high quality resources is not just providing resources based off of our clinical recommendations or our clinical assessments, but also assessing and addressing the social and environmental factors that impact the health and well-being of school communities we may be serving. All right, so that narrative placed into an image, folks may have seen kind of a public health triangle, and we apply the same image to what we refer to as multi-tiered systems of support. So that's providing those comprehensive school mental health services, not just again at tier 3, which is that red section at the top, where we should only have a few students who have intensive or more serious concerns that affect their daily functioning. We're also doing tier 2, so that may be like group services, evidence-based practices like cognitive behavioral interventions for trauma in schools, or coping CAT for anxiety. So we may be more familiar with those tier 2 and tier 3 services. What I'm really here to advocate for today is tier 1 supports that we have the skills to use, but are more regularly pulled into tier 2 and tier 3 supports and services during a time when tier 1 resources are needed at a level that we just have not seen in the past. And so that's more of a promotion of general skills among student bodies, but also amongst staff to support their social, emotional, and behavioral skills. And again, what you see there at the bottom, that this work is done with the foundation of family, school, community partnerships and professional development to support a healthy workforce. Now, why? Why do we need a comprehensive approach to school mental health? Why can't we just go into classrooms, pull the students from their class and take them into our office and deliver their tier 3 individual service? Here's why, and this is pre-COVID. So in a classroom of 30 students, we would know prior to COVID that at least 20% would experience some mental health challenge of mild impairment. And 1 in 10 would have more of a severe or moderate impairment. Now, probably most problematic is that less than a third of our babies, I often call them our babies, but our students, our young people who actually need mental health services access the supports they need. Now, that's for many reasons. Historical barriers, such as financial, challenges, transportation issues, stigma, etc. There are lots of reasons, but those challenges and that lack of access has only continued and grown with the pandemic. My colleague, Mark Weiss, refers to this as the peri-pandemic period. We're really seeing the full circle effects of COVID-19 and how it's impacted our young people, as well as the adults who are responsible for serving them. And so what we have now is more young people in need of preventative interventions to be successful in school and to address those consequences associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. And so what does that look like? Well, it looks like increased mental health supports, especially at the tier 1 level. And we'll talk more about why that's important here soon. But that's to address the widespread trauma that we know exists now more than it had before. So I'm so sorry, y'all. We're going to watch a brief video. This video is about 4 minutes and I think like 40 seconds long. But I want to center this video just to think about some of the invisible burdens that our young people may be carrying with them as they walk through the world, but also as they are expected to function in academic spaces and be successful. So I'm going to let this play. And Dr. Fabiano, if you could just verbally in a moment come off of mute and let me know that you can hear it and see it appropriately.
Yes.
I'm from Haiti and Nigeria. Like 3 things, like I'm Dominican, Puerto Rican, and Black. I'm biracial. I have an African-American father and an Irish-American mom.
My name's Lamine. I'm Muslim.
I'm Indian, British, Scottish, and American.
My parents are from Venezuela, and I was sharing like one of the foods that we eat, and then I got made fun of. They were like, "What is that? Ew. Oh, ew, what is that?" And like I cried because I felt like, oh, there's something wrong where I'm from. Like maybe like it's bad. Like I'm different.
I am an African-American adopted girl, only child, and I live with my 2 dads.
I remember when I was younger, I went with my family to a restaurant, and they made us pay in advance just in case we didn't pay afterwards, and that was kind of upsetting.
You start to notice that people are different and you have comments, they might be racist or they might not be, but by the time you get older, you know that it is racist and you should stop.
I feel a little scared about if I, just walk down the street, cops might just think I'm doing something bad, and then if I'm trying to explain to them, they won't listen and then just start beating me up and doing terrible things to me.
I think there's this anxiety that kind of comes with being biracial, that kind of eats away at you, almost like you have to prove yourself that you're one or the other. For example, I hear the phrase, "You're not Black," all the time.
People sometimes think that I'm supposed to talk ghetto or whatever that is.
Oh, she's uneducated because she's African American.
Because I'm Hispanic or Latino, I can't have a lot of money.
Just this weekend, I went with my friend to Urban Outfitters and we were shopping, and I really wanted to try on this dress, and then this lady that was just there, she was kind of watching me, and I'm just I'm not gonna steal it or anything.
I think white privilege is the idea that in your everyday life you're getting treated differently and sometimes with more respect, or people just trust you more, or they have certain expectations of you, like you might be smarter or you might be wealthier because you're white. It makes me feel guilty sometimes, even though it's not my fault. I feel guilty for having a privilege that I don't deserve.
If I was ever the mayor or something that controls the policemen, I would want to go out and look in the neighborhoods where there are people that's very friendly, so you can pick them instead of these guys that's just doing all this training. It's better to pick people that's more minded with the community than to just pick some new guy and get on the street. It's just not gonna work out.
We have these kids from, they're Ecuadorian, and they get made fun of because they look Mexican, And they get told on a daily basis, oh, you like tacos? Oh, you like churros? How come I saw your mom on the corner selling ices? Like, it's, like, I feel bad for them personally, because I'm like, wow, like, they're not, and like, even though they tell them I'm not Mexican, I'm Ecuadorian, they still get teased.
All right, we'll stop that there. And every time I see this video, I feel like I have a different emotional response. I just want to give us a moment thinking about that video and just our experiences as professionals, our experiences as people. What are some of those invisible burdens that youth are carrying around with them? Those day-to-day experiences that may go unacknowledged and unaddressed. And we can use the chat box to share our thoughts. I'll give us about a minute for that. Thank you, Jerry, for getting us started. I see parental and familial disputes. Jenny, thanks so much. Looks like having family responsibilities, of caring for family members and siblings. I see there are lots of invisible burdens, family factors, environmental, acculturation, racism. Yes, one's own self-identity, how they view themselves. School responsibilities, yes. Differing immigration status with family. And yes, the list is never ending, and it could be so many things. But some of the examples that are coming to mind are food insecurity, struggling with queer identities, invisible disabilities, and chronic illnesses. Exactly. Thank you all so much for contributing your ideas. And the reason I asked this question is because it really sets the stage for us understanding why it's so important to think about manners of reaching communities, often falling into categories of inequity, because systemic, institutional, individual level oppression, discrimination, and bias are at the root of inequities that we have seen for a long time. And part of disrupting these long-standing issues in our schools, in our education systems, in our mental health systems, is making sure we're looking for those invisible burdens that people are carrying and figuring out how to serve them. And that requires us to take a step back and think a little bit more about it. So thank you for sharing your ideas, and we'll move us into just calling out very specifically a couple of inequities we should be aware of that are impacting some of the communities that we're serving. But yeah, this image here, just to that idea that our young people are carrying so much. And sometimes there's that expectation that you drop your bags at the door, but we are all human beings who have probably tried to drop our bags here and there and have been unsuccessful at many times. Sometimes we've been successful, and others not noticing, but it also didn't mean that we were okay. And so looking for those invisible burdens and thinking about creative ways of addressing them, especially in our young people, is really important. All right, so when I think about mental health literacy, I just want to kind of ground us in health equity, right? This idea that it's the attainment of the highest level of health for all people. Everyone deserves that, but we know from very clear, longstanding research that there are just so many instances where specific groups of people are not experiencing the highest level of health. And here are just a few examples, and I'm only going to call out a couple. I'll start with the first one, with Black, Indigenous, and other persons of color more likely to report various access barriers for mental health, including misdiagnosis, low quality care, not receiving culturally responsive care. And then even when they are engaging in therapeutic processes, experiencing poorer health outcomes or not experiencing the gains expected through a therapeutic process. Importantly, to the topic of mental health literacy, BIPOC youth and families also receive less education in their engagement with mental health than their white counterparts. And so overall, what we're seeing is people of color are not being given the information they need to make good decisions about the care their loved ones are receiving and how to best engage with those services. And then stigma is really high amongst traditionally or historically minoritized racial and ethnic groups as compared to whites due to mistrust of systems, experiences with systems and medical systems, mental health systems that have felt stigmatizing or discriminatory. So there are real fears that become barriers to folks accessing care or utilizing it in a manner that's productive. And then just thinking about our LGBTQ plus populations and the political atmosphere we find ourselves in, we know that a lot of what's ongoing and what's discussed in the media, whether or not laws are passed, they're harmful. And those discriminatory beliefs being shared nationally, globally, it is harming our young people and contributes to increased rates of depression, self-harm, suicidality. And so it's not these subpopulations that are the problem, it's the perception of identities and bias and discrimination and oppression against these groups that poses problematic and creates inequities in health for specific groups of people. Now, what can we do about it? Inequity has existed for a long time. And again, it's not just a problem rooted in individuals' actions, like my individual action or someone else's individual action. Sure, we have a role, but there are institutions and systems much larger than us that we're sometimes a part of. What can we do? I would like to say that we can do so much. I am an endless hopeful, even creating spaces like this to have this type of conversation. It's a way of disrupting what we know are problematic trends that are hurting certain groups of people more than others. And so when I look at some recommendations from CDC, one of the most important things we can do is increase students, and I would insert staff, mental health literacy via classroom-based instruction. We can, of course, we know the power of promoting SEL, enhancing connectedness, psychosocial skills training, and supporting school staff well-being. I like the topic of mental health literacy because truthfully, it kind of addresses the first four you see listed with some evidence of supporting school staff well-being also. And I'll get a little bit more into that right here. So when I say mental health literacy, what am I talking about? Mental health literacy has its roots in health literacy. It's just the idea that you understand what contributes to health. And traditionally, what contributes to good health had been focused on physical trends, right? A lot of us, or probably all of us, had physical education when we were in school, and that is still a class to this day. Now, we would say that physical health education should also incorporate mental health education, and that's what we're talking about today. So it's programming designed to increase awareness of mental health or mental health knowledge and decrease stigma. And it has 4 key anchors. And so it's the points listed on the slide. So that's number 1, I see it as number 1, giving folks the skills they need to promote their own well-being generally. Number 2 there to the right, recognizing signs and symptoms of distress so folks know when they're struggling and that giving them a hint toward when they may need to seek help. Toward the bottom, it also teaches people, students and staff about common diagnoses and introduces the idea that treatment varies based on needs. Because oftentimes I run into people who think that mental health treatment is one thing. It's dream analysis or it's medication. So this is really meant to debunk myths and help people understand that treatment options are pretty vast, depending on what type of diagnosis we're dealing with. And then, of course, there's a component dedicated to thinking through how to seek help and where to seek help. And there's lots of evidence to support mental health literacy. So in the United States, the research is kind of in its infancy, but we have international colleagues who have been doing mental health literacy, especially in Canada, for many years, for about 20 years. And there's strong evidence to suggest that high levels of mental literacy are associated with better mental health amongst youth, with lower mental health literacy putting folks at higher risk of experiencing depression. And we know that mental health literacy and positive attitudes towards psychotherapy enhance access to treatment, where people are asking for help more often and willing to engage with treatment providers. And inaccurate knowledge, of course, increases stigma, and that hinders help-seeking behaviors when mental health presentations or symptoms are present. And so why schools? Because that's my jam. Schools are my jam. They have been forever and always will be. And it's because in schools, we've reached the largest number of students. And so earlier I referenced that about 30% of young people, only about 30% of young people who need the help actually access the care that they need. Now, of those individuals who access care, 70% of them receive that mental health treatment in school settings. So we know it's just a great place to deliver the information that we know all people need to live a healthy life. And so we can equip them with critical skills when we're functioning within school settings and reach a larger number of students. Mental health literacy also increases educator awareness of mental health and reduces stigma amongst adults, and sometimes even increases their help-seeking behavior. But importantly, their knowledge and their ability to support their students in a school context. And then toward the bottom there, this is a sell point. If you're talking with school leadership and they need to know why. Why do you want me to do mental health literacy? Why is this important? You can say basically because when students feel better, they do better. And the research shows us very clearly that when students' mental health needs are addressed, their behaviors improve, they experience more academic success, and they have better attendance. What administrator does not want to hear that? In addition to that, so I mentioned that our research in the US is kind of in its infancy based on some good evidence from our colleagues internationally. I was a part of a 5-year randomized control trial study as a co-PI, and we use a mental health literacy program called The Guide. We actually adapted it, and we expected some of the same outcomes that we see in the literature around decreasing stigma and increasing help seeking, and we did come across that in our analyses. But to our surprise, through focus group sessions, we also learned the importance of mental health literacy in building relationships between teachers and students. And for me, that was thrilling because I, like many of my colleagues, and probably lots of you all, realize that relationships are the vehicle through which any positive outcome is attainable. That is my stance, that if we have a positive relationship, we can almost always create some positive outcome with our young people. And so we learned through our focus group sessions that occurred annually as a quality improvement process that the guide helps open up conversations between teachers and students about mental health and societal stressors, which we had a lot of. This study occurred between 2019 and 2024, so it just wrapped up. And there are lots of societal stressors and more ahead, that it helped students to develop a common language with their educators around mental health, that students and teachers experienced improved relationships, and teachers felt that they better understood their students. This came during a time which is still current, where teachers are interfacing with more behavioral and emotional challenges in classroom settings, likely related to the just national trauma our young people and our adults have experienced through the pandemic and other societal issues. And so we learned that in addition to decreasing stigma, increasing help seeking, we're also building positive relationships between adults, key adults in the lives of students, which ultimately will result in more positive outcomes for our young people. And these are just two quotes from teachers. I'll move to the one on the right, which I think is a sell point for teachers, where Teaching the Guide empowered her students to open up and deal with issues that were often swept under the rug. This in turn lessened issues in their school with students because the kids would take ownership and stop small problems from becoming big problems. We've seen so many situations in schools where these little instances grow to be really dramatic challenges that impact many students and sometimes result in disciplinary referrals, which we never like to see. And so there's so much strength in providing mental literacy in classrooms, some of which we didn't expect. So I'm gonna pause for a moment this is just a question I kind of want to anchor us in. So who can benefit from mental health literacy, and how can mental health literacy be integrated into tier 1, 2, and 3 supports and services? Just given time, and I want to leave a little time for questions at the end, I'm going to kind of push forward and talk about these. As much as I don't like hearing my voice, I'm going to keep going, listening to my voice. So who can benefit? Well, what I would put in this slide, if I could, is everyone, but I'll break it down a little bit further. We do know from research that students report decreased mental stigma and increased help seeking. We also are learning that teachers report that teachers with higher mental literacy report decreased burnout and improved student-teacher relationships. To that first point, I would think that that's related to teachers better understanding their students, because how often are teachers burnt out by not having the skills to intervene with students' challenges? They don't know why they're having the challenges, and they're not sure what to do to support them through it. Mental health literacy teaches exactly that. Some of the reasons folks may be experiencing emotional and behavioral dysregulation and coping strategies for addressing them. So I think that's a really important point around teachers benefiting from the curriculum. But also we've learned from some more recent literature in the US that folks responsible for MTSS or multi-tiered systems of support teams, those participants, the school-based professionals with higher mental health literacy, make more competent referrals to mental health supports over disciplinary action. This is particularly important when we're talking about youth of color and boys, because oftentimes behavior is seen as a disciplinary issue. But when I think of behavior, I think that all behavior is communication. And oftentimes, an appropriate referral is sending them to someone they can talk to, whereas disciplinary action rarely fixes the challenge that the student is encountering. So our professionals in schools benefit from having better understanding of what mental health distress looks like and resources for supporting young people experiencing distress. And then finally, parents and caregivers. We all probably know this in this space, but when parents and caregivers understand their role in treatment, what the purpose of it is, how it's going to help their child, they're more engaged in treatment services and report better outcomes by the time they've completed the therapeutic process. And so I'm going to go back and say who can benefit? Everyone, but these groups in particular. So moving forward into integrating mental literacy across the tiers, I'm going to start with universal because that's what I'm really advocating for today. If we're folks who are based in school settings and we're clinicians, our skills are really valued in that setting, especially for students who folks may refer to as the high flyers or, that kid, because we can see young people with more intensive, obvious needs. But our services at this point, giving the expanded and growing needs of our youth generally, our skills are really needed at tier 1, and we should prioritize that whenever possible. And so what does that look like at the tier 1 level? It can look like many things that I have listed here on the left side. If there are any school leaders or folks who represent leadership at the district or state level, I would advocate for funding to support professional development around mental health literacy, equipping educators and other school-based staff with the resources they need to actually understand what some of the mental health needs are of students and what mental health literacy programs they can begin to implement within their settings. If there are school-wide work groups or teams like the PTA, Parent-Teacher Association, or peer-led groups, those are outstanding networks to have because they too can be the facilitators of mental health literacy with parents, for example. The PTA can lead that. With peer groups, I love the idea of adolescents being trained in some type of mental health literacy curriculum and them actually facilitating it within their classrooms. School-wide activities, that is a missed opportunity often to simply destigmatize mental health. There should be flyers that are just about simple things like, here's a coping skill of the week. Have you ever tried this? What do you do to pursue joy, right? Maintaining well-being. Sharing resources. What are the mental supports available in the school? Part of the reason families don't engage with services because they simply do not know what's available to them. But use those opportunities to destigmatize mental health. Always have something present to share about the resources accessible, especially just tangible, easy, non-threatening skills like coping. And then finally, toward the bottom there, classroom implementation. This is a more direct way of integrating mental health literacy, and there are many free mental health literacy programs I'm going to share. I do want to point out, just going back to this idea of inequity, there's going to be more stigma around mental health in specific communities. I grew up in a Black community, clearly. In my family, I remember when I first told them I was going to be a psychologist, they looked at me like I had 10 eyes, because why would I become a therapist when they would never talk to a therapist, when no one in my family has ever talked about psychology or anything like that. It just was not part of my cultural experience to rely on psychologists to help you address your personal needs. This Tier 1.5 by Nygaard and colleagues is a recent article on mental health literacy where they use a Tier 2 intervention. It was Bounce Back, which is a trauma prevention program for Tier 2, but they use it within classrooms and call it a Tier 1.5 because the clinician teamed with a teacher to implement the content in a classroom where they were aware the community had been significantly impacted by lots of historical traumas, including living in communities where there are high rates of violence, and also exposure to essentially indicators of poverty. So instead of just doing a general mental health literacy curriculum, they implemented a more useful and targeted intervention to address the traumas that are present more universally in their student body, which is a really smart way to approach giving kids the supports they need, especially if we're not likely to see them at Tier 3 because of stigma, right? We need families to agree to services at Tier 2 and Tier 3. But in classrooms, we can just deliver the resource to everyone universally. So it's a very smart study. And so you all should check that out if you have a chance. There are other less direct or less formal ways to integrate mental health literacy, such as daily check-ins. Folks are familiar with that, but intentionally integrating language around mental health literacy. So that could be something like, again, what coping skill did you use last week? How are you feeling today? Is there anything that's bothering you? Giving folks opportunities, or students in particular, opportunities to think about how mental health shows up in their lives. If any symptoms are present, even asking them, who did you seek help from this week? Questions like that can be easily integrated into these standing practices. And then SEL activities. It's always helpful to teach young people these skills, though it's different from mental health literacy. And then at Tier 2 and Tier 3, all right, I'm doing okay on time, go me. So at Tier 2 and Tier 3, now I would say mental health literacy is oftentimes integrated into the evidence-based programs we're using with families and youth at Tier 2 and mostly at Tier 3, but sometimes at Tier 2. And I'm gonna start at the top with school teams. It's important, again, to think about the mental health literacy of the folks who are seated at our multi-tiered systems of support teams, our wellness teams, our IEP teams, because those professionals hold so much power in the access young people have to resources. And so again, if they're looking at the behavior of a child and only seeing it as behavior, as opposed to recognizing the potential symptoms of mental health challenges that are present, we end up with a lot of referrals that result in disproportionate treatment, disproportionate referral to discipline. And then oftentimes, that can result easily or contribute easily to what many refer to as the school to prison pipeline. We know that our young people deserve mental health supports in schools. They should not first receive them when they're behind bars, which my colleague, Michael Lindsay, who studies depression in Black boys, has found that the first time most boys of color behind bars are accessing mental health care is when they're in jail. And that is a tragedy. So we need to ensure that the folks who hold power in giving access to care actually have the mental health literacy needed to make appropriate referrals. In addition to that, when we're parts of those teams, how can we interweave mental health literacy into the conversations? If we're at those tables, what information can we share with families who are attending the meeting so that they're aware of what's accessible to them through the IEP team, through the MTSS team, whatever teams we're talking about at the moment? How can we share the information that they need to address any stigma that may be present, any reason they're declining services? make sure that you're equipped with resources that I'll share in just a minute to provide people with the education they need to make the best decisions for their families. Now, in clinical education, which lots of us are familiar with, again, lots of evidence-based programs, or most of them, feature some type of what we call psychoeducation. I always advocate for dropping the psycho part because if you say it to families, they're like, huh? But the education component is really important, yet research shows us that communities of color, or parents and families of color, are likely to receive less education about the treatment priorities and purpose and their engagement required for success. And so here are just a couple of key points listed. The ones with asterisks are just where I see additional opportunities to think more about the cultural needs of the folks we're working with. And so when we discuss coping skills in particular, thinking about some of the traditional and historical or cultural healing resources within a person's network is also important in the education phase. That's not necessarily teaching them what they need to be well, but asking them, what are some of the resources in your community that you have access for healing? Okay, that's a way to help people experience better outcomes, is integrating them, their cultural history, into the treatment process very intentionally. And then cultural help seeking too. Sure, we have lots to offer, but mental health cannot be the all for every need that people have. Sometimes they need their church community. Sometimes they need their great grandma, their aunts. They need other folks involved when they are in distress. And so it's important for us to think about how we make them more aware of the ways they can seek help that include mental health providers, but also extend to folks in their community that may feel healing or safe for them. And then toward the bottom there, in schools, this is a huge opportunity. We have to do more school-based mental health literacy for parents. I'm currently leading a grant focused on parenting programs in schools, and I'm thrilled about it. It's really hard to do because of parents' work schedules and just the way in which a number of our interventions are created. But within those settings, it's just so important that parents have the information and skills they need to support their children. I have yet to meet a parent that does not want the best for their child. I have not. And while parents may present with demeanors that do not strike you immediately as serving of their child, I can tell you they're oftentimes doing the best they can. And with education that comes from a safe person, someone who is genuinely concerned about that parent's ability to support their children, folks want to learn. They want to do better by their children. And so one way we can make learning safe for parents is thinking about peer support. Are there caregivers in the service community you're situated within who can be kind of the middle person when folks are first engaged? Can we refer them to someone who's also accessed the service before so they can kind of warm them up to the idea of what therapy would be like, and then begin to kind of answer some of their questions or concerns around their fears related to therapy, because those are present for lots of communities of color and other traditionally or historically marginalized populations. And so we need to be thinking about how you can provide mental health literacy support at tier 2 and tier 3, and then again broadly at tier 1 for caregivers. And then with a focus on equity. So data, use the data to promote equity. Do not look at data in aggregate to make decisions about services being provided. Disaggregate that stuff, have fun with it. Any levels of data you have, just aggregate it. Race, ethnicity, gender, SES, religion, ability status, whatever you have, just aggregate the data so that we can think about who's benefiting and who's not. When we do that, then we're better able to put in place more inclusive interventions for the populations we serve. Be prepared to adapt programs and processes to promote access and impact. Again, lots of our evidence-based curriculum were normed in communities that don't resemble some of the communities we serve. And so it's important to have that awareness and think about some of the community's views around mental health and what affects folks' abilities to seek help. And think about what adaptations can be made to mental literacy programs to promote relevance and inclusion. There are lots of articles out there about how to make evidence-based adaptations for communities you serve, such as changing the facilitator of the content. Sometimes just changing the person facilitating can increase the relevance of content and make it more impactful. excuse me. And then include lots of open-ended questions. That is if I could give anyone a key takeaway, is when you're delivering any type of education, integrate open-ended questions. Ask folks about their experiences with mental health. You're going to tell them what mental health is or some of the key signs of mental health distress, but also ask them, what have you seen that may indicate that mental health distress is here? What are your experiences with healing? What helps you to cope when things go wrong? Open-ended questions is a great way to learn from the historical narratives of the folks we are serving and integrate what we learn about them into treatment. That alone will increase the likelihood that they experience positive outcomes in our Tier 3 services. And then toward the bottom there, not a single one of us can be everything to anyone. And sometimes we have to collaborate because we just don't have the skills, the knowledge, the expertise, the years of practice required to either make the adaptations or appropriately identify curriculum that we think would be most helpful for the community. So bring in folks who may. One untapped resource I often see is community-based organizations surrounding the school. I was in the school for 5 years, and in my second year, I identified a group directly across the street. It was a peer mentorship program that also paid for their youth to go to college. No one in the school community knew about them. In fact, they were trying to get more students from the school I was based in to commit to the program. All I had to do was introduce them directly to the principal, but no one knew that key program was there. Collaborate, see who's in the community and bring them in to support some of your mental health literacy opportunities. And collaborate with educators. I find that in urban settings, in some urban settings, you'll have educators who are from the same community that they went to school. They went to school and decided to teach there. Use their expertise, collaborate with them, allow them to show you and teach you some of the ways in which we can increase the effectiveness and impact of the services that we have at our fingertips. I'm going to quickly run through these so I can leave like 2 minutes for questions. I'm so sorry. I had great time and then I didn't. The first one, this is the PSW, we call the PSW guide. This is our adapted version of the guide mental health literacy program that we use for our 5-year randomized controlled trial. You go to that link there or scan the QR code, it'll take you to the website and you would have access to all the resources there. To our knowledge, it was the first randomized controlled trial to use the guide. In our current version, I'll actually delete that slide. Our current version features 5 topics and it was implemented in 10 schools across 2 states. And again, to our great surprise, received glowing feedback from teachers and clinicians, but most impressive to me was the teachers. The teachers in our study actually knew the name of the program, and I have not had that been my experience in the past. They know that we're doing some mental health thing, but they don't often call it by its name. Another resource, so the folks out of Canada I mentioned earlier, if you go to mentalhealthliteracy.org, you will come into their website where they have resources for schools and classrooms, I think pre-K through 12. So they have a pretty comprehensive resource toolkit. Again, the resources were developed for youth in Canada, but adaptations can help with implementing some of those resources too. I think you should check it out. It's a wealth of helpful information. And there are just so many things out there. It really depends on the classroom, the developmental level we're talking about, or the audience that we're talking about. But you can integrate resources like Jane the Brain. She's really cute and has 3 episodes. There are also STEM teaching resources. If you check this out at National Institutes of Health. And then the last resource that I just want to point out today is the Mental Health Literacy Collaborative. They are a group dedicated to bringing together mental health literacy leaders in the US and beyond, with the goals of supporting advocacy and education, content identification, and mental health literacy research, and policy guidance. And on their website, there are lots of resources as well. So I'm going to stop there. I have these questions just kind of thrown out in case folks were interested in talking about them, but I'm going to stop my share and check in with Dr. Fabiano to see if there are any questions to discuss.
We have a couple of questions in the chat. Thank you. Terrific talk. Did anybody want to jump in and ask a question? I have one that I want to ask, but I don't want to go first. Anybody else want to ask anything? I think, Jerry, we kind of talked about services being implemented in school for parents and caregivers. Elena had a question about the tension between trying to conceptualize the approaches providing mental health or psychotherapy or services relative to perhaps the school professionals' approach of thinking more about punitive strategies or discipline, and how you maybe effectively negotiate that tension.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I've run into so much resistance. It's fun. At a point, it becomes really, really fun because I like motivational interviewing and I like to roll with the resistance. And so I will just acknowledge it. I'll say, hey, I'm hearing the resistance here. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? So my first step is actually to ask an open-ended question, roll with the resistance and ask them a little bit about where that's coming from. And then often my next question is, well, can I share a little bit with you about what I know related to this type of behavior in young people and what it can mean? And then what they usually say is yes. They're not going to say no because that's, in the face of other people, it's usually seen as disrespectful. So they'll say yes. And then that's my opportunity to share. Behavior often is misunderstood. And I usually start with my catchphrase, which is all behavior is communication, and it's communicating a need. So what need could be communicated here? And then I'll share my thoughts from there. And so if you haven't been trained in motivational interviewing, I would highly recommend it. I'm sure lots of people have here, but get more practice in using those skills with confronting leadership in particular, because you'll need it, especially in our atmosphere, socially. There's lots of opportunity for rolling with resistance and having really genuine conversations based in helping this youth to be as successful as possible. That's the one other thing I will share is that when I use motivational interviewing, it is not to make anyone feel silly or foolish or hurt. It really is to understand where the person's coming from. Another key strategy in confronting resistance is finding our common place. Where do we agree? And so be good reflective listeners, find what it is that motivates them the most and say, hey, it sounds like we're all on the same page. We want this child to be successful in school. We want this child to be able to stay in the classroom day to day. Here are some ideas. Are you open to hearing some of the ideas I have? So find that common place. And then when you struggle, rely on a little bit of my skills.
One of the coolest examples of mental health literacy I think I've seen is from you, that you created a children's book yourself to try to speak directly to youth in a way that maybe was a little bit more effective than the top-down approach we often use in some of our ways. And I think some of the people here might be interested to hear about that and kind of how you've used it in practice.
Oh, thank you. I almost forget about it here and there. I call it my work of heart. My book is called The Fight. And it's called The Fight because I learned from all of the beautiful, smart, talented children I've worked with that they actually end up in physical and verbal fights simply because of the hurts they've experienced and folks not building relationships with them. They're responding to their hurt. So their behavior is communication. But I want to teach our babies through love and support how to fight in a way that's more powerful for them. So The Fight is actually a pretty concise tool. But it features a story of a young girl dealing with an interpersonal challenge with a peer. And she's given the option to go down the powerful route or the powerless route. And on the powerful route, she's taught 5 core skills. And so the first is feelings. So FIGHT is an acronym. The F stands for feelings. The I stands for identity. So that's your strengths and resources. The G is goals, what goals you have for yourself. The H is healthy coping. And the T is thoughts, the things that you think about yourself. And so it's really a resource that I've seen teachers use really well. It's an opportunity for them to get to know their students, but also ask questions around the coping skills students have and give them an opportunity to teach some new ones. I've seen it used a lot in peer mentorship programs and also in just, there's this one group, what are they? They're the YMCA. It's an older adult population where they struggle to connect with the kids because they're so much younger. It's, adults who are volunteering their time, they're retired. And the book features lots of questions that just gives you an opportunity to get to know the child in front of you and teach them really productive ways to use that kind of fight energy they have so that it's helpful for them and non-harmful for their future. So really concise tool. If you want to check it out, feel free. It's my work of heart, and I hope that it benefits maybe some of the young people that you may serve.
It's a really nice way to connect with kids on, I think, a nice kid level. But what's really kind of clever is it integrates all of the cognitive behavioral or coping skills approaches we might think about talking about in a narrative story that a child or adolescent might connect with better. So it's really neat, really
Thank
neat
you.
thing.
Thank you.
So we're at the hour. Maybe we give Dr. Patterson a round of applause. Thank you very much for a terrific talk. Certainly I'm thinking, I have a lot to think about and how I'm working with some of the schools I'm working with right now. And as they move more towards these MTSS approaches, I think this is going to become really critical. So thanks for an excellent presentation.
Thanks so much for having me. Take care all. Be well.